Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm here to speak in my capacity as someone who detransitioned. I'm going to basically go sort of through my life story and give a profile of one type of person that may pursue transition, um, someone who didn't experience any type of gender dysphoria until young adult years. Sorry, my PowerPoint has frozen on me. Here, I'm gonna go back. Okay, so in my childhood, I would have been considered a gender non-conforming person. So when I say that, I mean I didn't like wearing dresses. I was doing tomboy activities, things that would be considered something a tomboy would do, physical activities outside, climbing trees, playing sports. When I was a little older, collecting Pokemon cards, playing video games. These are things that I mostly saw boys doing, not so much girls, and role playing as male characters. But psychologically, as a child, I also had a high need for control, which would mean I really wanted things to go my way. And if they didn't go my way, then I would get really upset. I just needed to be, it was very particular. And that leads into the next point, which is that I was very emotionally reactive. It was very easy to make me angry, very easy to get me to start crying, etc. And finally, the third point that I added is that I had a lot of body focused repetitive behaviors. Now, those three ways that I've described myself, that's not how I would have described myself as a kid or how other people would have described me. They would have described me as bossy, or in a good situation, they might say I had leadership skills. And they'd also point out that, the fact that I was so reactive, that's why I was getting bullied. So, but that's what it led into essentially, is that those body focused repetitive behaviors were things like picking my nose, chewing my nails, licking my lips, etc. So having all those things together, it turns out that a lot of people don't really like bossy kid with weird habits who is really easy to like take off. So I became a target for bullying. And over those years, pretty much every single day, I was having these messages put into me that I'm gross and I'm ugly and nobody likes me. So into adolescence, I started experiencing depression. I had very few friends. I was self-harming when I was in my mid-teen years, although the very first time I self-harmed, I was 11. But also going on in adolescence was a little bit of exploration of gender. So where I was a tomboy when I was younger, I was trying to explore traditional femininity, so wearing skirts and trying makeup. But even so, femininity felt really foreign to me. And also during these years, I was starting to date. I had relationships mainly with older men. So a lot of the people my age didn't seem to like me, but I noticed that men who were older did seem to like me, which is unfortunate actually. So my first relationship was with an 18-year-old man when I was 14. And the last relationship that I had in this time period was with someone 4 years older than me, but I was in my last year of high school. And that relationship was very bad. It was very emotionally abusive, very controlling. And in all of those relationships, I had very uncomfortable experiences with sex. So I was being coerced into doing things that I wasn't ready to do. And it just wasn't enjoyable for me at all. So that last relationship, we ended up breaking up in 2008. And after that point, I felt like I really needed to recapture my agency in this relationship where I'd been so controlled. So I moved in with my friends and lived in the city of Toronto. And one of the things I did immediately was more exploration of my own aesthetic and of gender expression, but I went in the opposite direction. So I went to more of what I was doing as a child, as a tomboy. So wearing men's clothing, I got interested in men's formal wear. I was cutting my hair short and eventually binding my breasts as well. And coinciding with this was I was finally getting into social media, especially Tumblr. And particularly, I was introduced to social justice activism. And that's the first time I heard about the idea of being transgender. So during that questioning period of time between 2008, 2010, I was introduced to being what trans meant and the idea of gender dysphoria. And I noticed that the way that people spoke about gender dysphoria on social media, they would often refer to really, really common experiences, sometimes even universal experiences, things like, you know, if you feel like you don't fit in, that's gender dysphoria, or, you know, things along those lines where it felt like it could be something that could really be attributed to anything, but it was being specifically pointed to as being gender dysphoria. And I didn't have any other options. So even though I might have been bullied for many, many reasons as a child, to me, I thought, you know what, maybe because of all of these other reasons as well, I didn't fit in with girls, I didn't like makeup, I was obsessively thinking about my gender, maybe what the real answer is this all happened because I'm trans. So that's sort of how the looking for proof started. There's the way that people talk about trans online is if you think you're trans, you are. There's very little of people telling you that you're not trans or that you should think about not transitioning. It's very, very encouraged to transition specifically. And the example I put there is amitransgender.net, because if you go to that website, what you get is the word yes in big letters. So that's one example of sort of the influence in that regard. And a related, I guess, thing that people would say often is that only a trans person would question their gender this much. So, of course, I was obsessively hyperfixated on this idea that I could be transgender. So I thought, well, this is even more proof. The fact that I'm thinking about it this much itself is proof. So I looked through my history and I thought, you know what? All of these reasons must be why I'm trans. And the more that I thought about it, I think I actually sort of created my own gender dysphoria throughout this, because before about 2008, I didn't want my breasts removed. But as I thought about it more and more and more, then I started to want them removed. And I believe that it sort of almost, it kickstarted it. Anyway, I reframed my whole life thinking, I was trans this whole time. Now, this is a timeline that I made of my medical transition. So in 2010, I told my parents and my family and friends that I believed that I was a transgender man in about February of 2010. And in the summer of that year, I attended a support group for people who were thinking about transitioning. I got a lot of information in that group, but specifically one of the therapists that ran the group, who's also trans, did about an hour meeting with me in which he wrote the letter recommending testosterone for me and referred me to a clinic. So that was how I got to a general practitioner. I didn't go to a gender identity clinic. I went to a general practitioner who prescribed testosterone for me in October of 2010. I had about, it was on my third appointment that they did that for me. And I went through the sort of a modified informed consent model. So I did require letters. The one from that one therapist recommending testosterone, and the other one was from my regular therapist who I was seeing for non-gender related reasons, who basically said that I was of sound mind to make that decision. I think it's worth pointing out, though, that that therapist had never had a trans client before, so she wouldn't have known what to look for, I don't think. But at any rate, 14 months after that, in January of 2012, I had a bilateral mastectomy. And in 2016, I actually stopped taking testosterone. And the reason, interestingly, it's been brought up, one of the main reasons was acne. I was still having acne 5 years down the road, and it was just terrible. So I wanted to stop. There were other things that sort of came into play. I wasn't interested in masculinizing my body anymore. It just wasn't a priority for me anymore. And another problem was that I was having issues with executive dysfunction, in that I was meant to take my shot every 2 weeks. And the day that I was supposed to take it would come, and then I just didn't want to do it. So I just pushed to the next day, and then the next day, and the next day. So I ended up taking shots every 3 weeks, and I thought, this is probably not good for me. So I stopped. And to coincide with that, I started identifying as non-binary instead of a trans man. And I continued to identify as transgender for another 5 years after that. The year following that, in 2017, I had a psychoeducational assessment because I was attending university and it wasn't going very well. And in that assessment, I was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. I had other diagnoses as well, but ones that might be relevant are I had significant traits of post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline personality disorder. What I find interesting is the psychologist who did this she didn't question my gender at all. So she just sort of took an affirming approach. My entire 25-page assessment is written with they, them pronouns, etc. But nowhere in there did she say, maybe something about this might make you reconsider your gender identity. Maybe something, maybe one of these developmental disabilities had something to do with your gender. I feel like this is a missed opportunity for her to bring this up with me. But because she didn't, I continued on the pathway I was on, and I had a hysterectomy the following year. Because I had stopped taking testosterone, I kept my ovaries. 2 years after that, November 2020, is when I detransitioned. And I announced to my family last year in February. And the thing that made me stop, that I decided to detransition, was that now that I had the diagnoses, it took me many years to really look into autism and ADHD and think about them and how each of these things might have affected me. And I look back on it and think, how could you possibly have missed this? This is something that would have been so crucial to the decision that I was making to transition. And it was never offered to me. So this is my last slide. When I came to sort of a form of understanding, and if I had had some type of gender exploratory therapy, this is what I would assume that it would look like, thinking about all of the possible other reasons that I didn't like makeup or dislike dresses. Like, those were sensory issues, actually. They had nothing to do with my gender. And then what you see on here is the blue squares are the things that I had think about before, and the orange squares are just new ideas that I had never thought of before. So, I transitioned, I think, as part of a coping mechanism. It was escapism. I was trying to get away from being female and the parts of it that I didn't like. And, passing helped me with anxiety because I felt like there were less pressures on me. But actually, when I started identifying as non-binary, one of the reasons was because I realized that there are actually gendered pressures, expectations of men as well, that I also didn't fit. So at the end of the day, what I feel like is that I had a complex psychological profile. And for some reason, for whatever reason, none of this was important to the people that assessed me. Enough that I didn't learn that I had autism or ADHD until 7 years after I was on testosterone, and until I had already permanently lowered my voice, had already gotten rid of my breasts, etc. And I think about all of the people, I have a lot of trans friends, and a lot of them also are young adults. A lot of them are young women, and they all have as well psychological profiles that are very complex. And for me personally, it's hard to believe that they were essentially born transgender, born in the wrong body, than to believe that they have similar things happening to them than I do. So that's basically where I'm going to stop. And that's my story.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for having me here. My name is Laura, and I actually am in college right now. I'm almost not, though. I'm going to be graduating in May with my art degree. And as cool as that is, I'm here to talk about my experience with transitioning and detransitioning as a young person with severe mental health issues, and the trauma that I've experienced going through these identity crises and the unnecessary medical interventions that I've had while being a college student. So to give some background, there's a lot of similarities between what Michelle talked about in her childhood and with mine too. Um, my whole life, I've been an unconventional person. I would say I was gender nonconforming, but I was just nonconforming in general, and gender happened to be part of it. In hindsight, I've realized that I never really fit into any box or social group. I was weird, sensitive, artistic, but I really struggled to make friends, and I got depressed very early on. I went through puberty starting around age 10, and I had polycystic ovarian syndrome, which I believe severely affected my hormonal and emotional regulation. And I don't think this was addressed today, but I will add that polycystic ovarian syndrome seems to be very, very prevalent among the trans population, is what I've noticed. And certainly for myself, it was an issue. I was diagnosed at age 11 with an autism spectrum disorder, PDD-NOS, which stands for pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, which is a very quirky way of saying there's something off about you, but I don't know what exactly. It's a catch-all term for someone exhibiting signs of autism, but not enough to meet the criteria for Asperger's. So needless to say, I never really got help for that because, what even does that really mean? It's not even a diagnosis anymore. So at 12, I was diagnosed with major depression and anxiety. And around the time of puberty, I started experiencing verbal and emotional abuse from family, which later contributed to me having a lot of mental health issues and even PTSD, which wasn't diagnosed until I was 22. So from age 11 and on, my self-esteem, hopelessness, suicidal behavior, destructive behavior, and overall quality of life just got increasingly worse. Since around age 14, I didn't feel safe in my own body or mind due to the emotional abuse. And I struggled with suicide and felt my life was worthless and that I was unlovable, helpless, and hopeless. And that just got worse every year. When I was 15 and a sophomore in high school, I started coping with my mental health issues through alcohol, weed, drugs, and cutting. Initially, the drugs helped me be less socially awkward and anxious, and I was able to make some friends, which was a huge deal for me. So I did begin to feel a little bit better, started experimenting with self-expression through identity, fashion, and doing creative activities like writing poetry about how I wish I could be loved and existentialism, the good artistic stuff. And although I started having a good social life, none of the trauma had really been addressed or healed. And I continued to get more depressed and hopeless. And I was sort of pathologized as just this depressed person. That was sort of my identity. And yet none of the core issues really ever got addressed. So around this time, I was really, really into self-expression, right? Because I'm very artistic. I started exploring my gender identity, which I'd learned about on Tumblr and in the Gay Straight Alliance at my school. It was a very accepting school. So there was a Gay Straight Alliance, and we learned about gender identities and on Tumblr. And I was very androgynous, right? I was very nonconforming, mostly just wearing like quirky and flamboyant outfits and mostly men's clothes. I never viewed myself as feminine or girly in style, attitude, personality, or behavior. So I started identifying as genderqueer, which to me, I rationalized that as, my gender is just weird. And initially it was a good thing. At first I loved the identity of androgyny and ambiguity because I was so nonconforming, it seemed to make sense. But as I continued to get more depressed, I really longed to have a romantic and intimate relationships with men and just to be loved in general. I had severe attachment issues, especially with men, and my self-hate and focus on my body and sex characteristics became really volatile. Throughout high school, I had 3 obsessional, limerent, unrequited loves for 3 different gay male friends of mine. They didn't really know they were gay because it was high school and I had attachment issues. So I didn't really know what was healthy or unhealthy. And I was just a teenager as well. So we were sort of hanging out in this artsy stoner nonconformist theater friend group where everyone was questioning their gender and sexuality. And that was all fine and good, to have our gender and existential concerns and sexuality confusion. But unfortunately, I also had undiagnosed trauma and PTSD, which paired perfectly with my insecurity. And they sort of used me, my friends, innocently enough, but they used me to figure out that they were gay, and they could never really reciprocate the love and attraction that I felt for them. And that made me extremely suicidal. The romantic crises and the sexual rejections combined with my unstable identity and self-worth manifested as gender dysphoria, which really was an intense fixation and hatred of my body, gender, sex role, sex characteristics, and just myself in general. I was extremely suicidal and I felt hopeless that I would ever be accepted, loved, appreciated, understood, or feel okay about myself just as a person. Although I was suicidal, my mom convinced me to go to a liberal arts college to just figure out some idea of the future because I was very suicidal. By the time I was 18 and graduating high school, I was very afraid of what might happen. But I did go to college, and while I was in the dorms, I can remember it was a very visceral time. It was a very traumatic time. I was severely suicidal, and all I did was ruminate and have nightly breakdowns about my heartaches and grief and why I was so unlovable and how much I wished I could just be a gay man instead of this like ugly, weird, straight girl. I was still very obsessed with one of my gay male friends who led me on really badly. It was a real catastrophe. That relationship was very toxic. But I just romanticized the idea of gay masculinity and how if I were a gay male, I could still be this type, have the personality that I had, right? So artsy, sensitive, dramatic and melodramatic and emotional, humorous, intense, non-conforming, but also be taken seriously by other people and understood in a way that I had never been as myself. And I thought that's somewhat because I'm a woman. I felt that a gay man could be able to love and be loved by men. So that's my very like black and white sort of view of that with my attachment issues and being in a suicidal state. Gay men get to love men and be with them and have sex with them and also be their sort of, true selves. They get to be all these things. And I want both of those things, but I can't seem to be accepted or have relationships or do either of those things. And I just suicidally ruminated on that. I felt like the ideal form of human for me, based on my personality and interests, especially sexual interest, was to be a gay man. So although I was not enthusiastic about the prospect of being a gay trans man, like I really didn't want to be trans, which is sort of a very different attitude that you normally might hear. I didn't want to be trans. I did think of it as a mental disorder. I did think of it as a condition, but for me, I'd been so medicalized already. I just thought, all right, well, I'm just broken. I'm just mentally ill like that. That's just another disorder to add to the list. So, I I don't want it though. I wish I didn't have any of these problems, but I think I do have this condition of gender dysphoria. But I felt like being a gay trans man, it was something besides killing myself, basically, as this miserable loser of a woman in person that I felt that I was. So I came out as trans in my second semester of college when I turned 19. I was accepted by my friends and family. Their opinion of that was that, I'd always just been sort of weird. I'd always been off. I'd been depressed for a very long time and suicidal. And so I sort of, they just sort of accepted, like, yeah, that must be the issue, because they didn't really know any better. And I convinced myself that that must be the problem, because otherwise I just didn't understand why I was so miserable. And at 18, I was seeing a therapist that I liked, a CBT therapist, but she told me that she didn't understand the gender issues and for me to seek out a gender therapist. And the gender therapist I found didn't seem to have much advice for me other than just that my experience was valid. And one day I tried to reschedule an appointment with her, but she just never contacted me again. So I'm not sure what happened with that, but it was very unprofessional. So I'm not sure what she would have said or done differently. I assume just kept affirming me. I tried to see other therapists who said they worked with gender issues, but none of them ever felt like they cared or understood me or provided any help with my mental health problems. They just weren't good quality therapists. I tried dozens of different medications over the years, but none of them ever seemed to have much of an effect. So they said that I had treatment-resistant depression. And so again, that just further made me feel like there was just something internally wrong with me that was just so severe that it might never be helped. I felt very helpless and very hopeless. So after ruminating about being trans for 3 years, obsessively, I went to my psychiatrist, who I was getting antidepressants from. I saw her maybe every 6 months, or maybe 4 to 6 months or so. She wasn't my therapist. She was just my psychiatrist. And I told her that I thought I was trans, and she told me that she would look into it. And she basically said, I don't know a ton about it, but I'll look more into it. And then the next appointment, she said that you seem to meet the diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria according to the WPATH standards of care. And I told her that I wanted to have top surgery. So I wanted to have a mastectomy to remove my breasts. And so she wrote me a recommendation letter to a surgeon advising him that I was mentally stable and of sound mind, and not suicidal, which is very interesting, because in reality, I was very unstable. I was very irrational. I was very suicidal. So I'm not sure if I only just appeared stable in that 45 minutes because I'm sort of good at talking. And this is another thing about a lot of these people who identify as trans. They're very intelligent. They're very articulate, and they have some level of awareness. But as one of my friends told me at the time, you are the most rational person at being irrational. Like, you can rationalize being irrational just so well. So it's one of my many skills, but I wasn't stable. And I actually admitted myself to a mental hospital for suicide ideation within a month of her writing the surgery recommendation letter. In the same month, I spoke to a transgender professor at my university who was teaching a sociology of sexuality class. She was a female to male trans man. And I just sort of lamented to her about being trans and how I didn't, how miserable it was. And she told me that, because I was talking about a lot of sexual insecurity, she told me that her sexual insecurity was solved by wearing a strap-on dildo, and that I could get testosterone for free at an informed consent clinic in another state. So that's actually where I learned about getting the testosterone. And so I visited the clinic and I told them just the rundown of my mental health issues, because I'm very forthcoming I'm, somewhat autistic or whatever you want us to call that. So I'm very, blunt and very upfront about it. So I told them everything, including being suicidal. But within an hour, they gave me the testosterone. And I was doing so badly right after I got out of the mental hospital. I took a semester off college, where my self-destructive behaviors really escalated on the testosterone. It was really, really bad. It was a terrible drug to be on. And in that time, I booked an appointment for top surgery for a mastectomy, where the surgeon required 2 letters from my doctor. So I got 1 letter from my psychiatrist and 1 from my general practitioner, who didn't really know me. She just sort of wrote this letter with no questions asked at all. So I gave the letters to the surgeon, and I ended up having the surgery, my breasts removed. And this is when I was 20. And even though I did tell the surgeon that I was feeling suicidal that day, he asked me, like, is it related to the surgery? And I said, no, it's related to other stuff, which was true. It was related to other stuff, but I now see that a lot of like what was going on at the time, the self-destructive behavior, it was related to the surgery too. But he still performed the surgery. And I walked away at 20 with no breasts. And I didn't feel any different after the surgery. In fact, I actually felt worse, because due to being on the hormones, my emotional problems got a lot worse, and I got into a lot of dangerous situations that caused me a lot more trauma. I felt so terrible after the surgery that I actually stopped the testosterone. And after 7 months of taking it, and I told myself that I would go back on to finish it when I became more mentally stable, when that never really happened. So from ages 20 to 22, I experienced a lot more traumas related to coping with all of these things. And finally, when I was 22, I went under a psychological evaluation where I was diagnosed with PTSD. And that's when it clicked for me that all of these things, that like special little something wrong with me that I couldn't really quantify or describe, it was actually PTSD. It was actually complex PTSD from the childhood abuse and all of the subsequent issues that followed it. And around that time, I found stories of detrans women and radical feminists on Tumblr writing about how trauma causes gender issues. And I quickly realized that the transition and the trans identity were just another manifestation of trauma, and that the entire identity had been a maladaptive coping mechanism. It took 2 more years of real mental health treatments such as CBT, DBT, mindfulness, and radical self-acceptance to finally start to heal from the 12 years of living in the trauma state. And since then, I've spent a great deal of time studying other detransition stories, gender issues, psychology, politics, and how and why so many young people, especially girls, are identifying as queer and transgender, and is what we talked about a lot today. In retrospect, my case was really similar to was what I call the archetype of the archetypal FTM, the quirky, sensitive, artistic, weird girl. And also it could be a boy too, but mostly girls. So it's this type of, it's very autistic. But it's an archetype. If you want to even break down autism, you break away from the label, that's sort of what it is. Quirky, artistic, sensitive, weird people. And in retrospect, my case was an obvious example of how abuse, autistic traits, identity confusion, attachment problems, undiagnosed trauma, and the cultural norms skewed me into a trans identity. And what is so obvious to me and other detransitioners beyond our personal narratives are the consistent themes of medical malpractice, just lazy psychotherapy, hot button activism, and emotional neglect offered by therapists, doctors, health clinics, professors, family, friends, and onlookers, all failing to help disturbed young people who are crying out for help with their gender identity issues. I had always spoken candidly and openly about my thoughts as irrational as they were, to anyone who would listen, because I was in desperate need of guidance, of a safe adult figure. And I was just always met with blank looks or shrugs or placating affirmations of being valid and other generic mental health advice. I can see now that what I really needed was to be convinced that I was worthy of love, as I was, and working towards better self-love and self-respect. But instead, I was affirmed that there was just something wrong with me that was preventing me from being happy, and maybe that was because of having a female body. So my synopsis now is, it's a disgrace to scientific medicine, nuanced psychological analysis, and human compassion to remove the breasts of an autistic 20-year-old girl because she hated herself and didn't know what she was doing in the midst of a traumatic crisis. I take responsibility for my own self-neglect and have spent far more time mourning my own self-disrespect than maltreatment from anybody else. But I also look to people in positions of authority like doctors and therapists to guide me in a safe direction and to know better. But unfortunately, it's just the reality that many doctors, therapists, universities, media personalities, parents, teachers, journalists, etc., they don't know better. They're ignorant to the mental health and social crisis that young people are facing today. And I believe that gender dysphoria is being diagnosed. It's a label for a myriad of complicated biopsychosocial issues that are being left completely untreated or mistreated using gender affirmation models. And a large part of this is happening on university campuses due to the cultural shift towards progressive inclusivity training and political correctness, which is a well-intentioned but misguided empathy towards marginalization, towards marginalized or unconventional people who, while they are suffering from complicated issues of the human condition that are swept under the rug in favor of gender and sexuality labels. And as Aaron talked about, it's very politically motivated versus medical. It's not compassionate or progressive to encourage a generation of young people that if they are depressed, feeling insecure about their bodies, don't conform to gender stereotypes, or just going through the process of puberty and development, that they must have a medical condition that requires interventions. That in my case, in the experience of many others I know, are left with disfigurements, disabilities of otherwise healthy body parts, and the worst part of all, still untreated root causes of their distress that are now compounded by the trauma of going through the gender transition and detransition process. While I believe that mature and psychologically healthy adults should have access to reasonable body modification, it's unacceptable to allow young people who, as we've discussed here today, their brains aren't fully developed. My prefrontal cortex has just kicked in. I've turned 25 this year, which has been a miracle. And also just time progressing. But that's why the watchful waiting model is preferred. And mentally sick young adults are not competent to give consent, and there's permanent damage being done. And in my case, even though I've worked extremely hard and I'm still working very hard to heal a lot of my wounds, there's certain things that I have to accept. Like if I ever have children, I won't be able to breastfeed them. So that's a really important thing. I can never sexually bond with someone using the body that I should have had. I'm missing out on some really crucial things, body parts. And I have permanent reminders carved into my skin of just how much I hated myself and how lost and confused I was in the past. And I hope that people here will consider the nuances that young people and students might be presenting with via the gender issues and offer more substantial mental health resources and understanding. And just my plug here, if anyone is interested to learn more about my story or work, I am an artist and a writer and a podcaster, and I do other stuff. And So if you're interested in that, I can provide links, but that's my story.
Would you like to say where people can find you? Thank you, Laura. That was amazing. Go on, tell us.
Yes, you can find me at funkgod.com or my Substack, Funk Life, or you can just email me at laurabeckerofficial@gmail.com.